I rarely ever go to the restroom after I'm mic'd up, even with it on mute. Sewell Hall did that one time, and his was unmuted. It was a ladies' Bible class, and it was a talk of the class. So I've always tried not to do that, so I apologize if I was alive. I made sure it was mute. All right, I appreciate everybody being here. By the way, where's my? Y'all give me a second. Need to be able to advance my slides. Yeah, here we go. All right. We were talking, seemed like forever ago now, but 3 weeks ago, this Wednesday, about we'd just gotten down to the 430 years that are mentioned in Galatians chapter 3, and I took the position that the 430 years, I still believe that that's exactly what he's talking about. That's basically Paul's argument in Galatians 3, where he says that the time from the giving of the covenant to Abraham until the coming out and the giving of the law was 430 years. And we had a discussion. He was not here when, Chuck was not here when I had made that, so he kind of took the other position. We talked about that a little bit. But I had just started. I wanted to spend just a minute, and I've already apologized to him, but I wanted to spend just a minute to walk you through what I started 3 weeks ago. And I apologize. This may seem like a bit of a wasted effort, but Beth and I were talking, and I said, my soul's salvation doesn't depend on me believing that it was 400 years in the land of Egypt or 430 years from the promise to the giving of the law. My soul's salvation does depend on me believing that there is an explanation. I may not be able to figure it out, but my faith, it is important for me to believe that there is an answer, and that it's, while we may not be able to comprehend, or we may not have enough information to make a definitive answer, it is important for us in our faith, I think, to at least examine some of these things. So I'll be honest with you, I spent way too much time on this. After Chuck's lesson, I went home, and he made the comment that there wasn't enough time in 230 years to go from 70 souls to 600,000 fighting men. I spent all afternoon, that Sunday afternoon, with a pad. I covered about 3 pages. I kept going over and over different scenarios and adding them up. I didn't even get a nap. I spent the entire time. Was it possible? And I finally determined that it was possible. Somebody says, well, anything's possible with God. We know God didn't make kids out of the sand. He just didn't do that. Whatever he did it naturally. Could he have? Yes, he could have. But that's not what he was talking about. And I'm firmly convinced that obviously he didn't do that. So we're just looking to see if it was a possibility. And I'll show you that slide in a few minutes, where I kind of sum up 3.5, 4 hours worth of doodling, where I went through all of that. And just to determine, was it possible? We talked a little bit about the 2 different readings in the Septuagint and about 6 other versions. It basically says that the sojourning of the children of Israel was in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt was 400 years. And that certainly is, I think, a very real possibility. What's interesting and what convinces me that it can't be 400 years is that we're only looking at 4 generations. In the passage where God is making the promise to Abraham, he says, in the 4th generation, you'll come out. Technically, it's 3 generations. In Exodus, the 6th chapter and verse 20, it says that Amram, who was the son of Kohath, married Jochebed, who was Kohath's sister. I don't know how all that works, but I'll tell you, in 4 generations, you've got some really, really, really old people having kids to get 400 years. So to me, this is probably one of the more definitive arguments, just showing that it's just hard to do. I went back again, spent way too much time. By the way, Kohath is mentioned as one of the 70. When you go into the book of Genesis chapter 46, it says 70 people went down. Kohath is mentioned as one of those. So if that's true, what I did, the column on the left, is I took him at he's young, okay, a couple of years old. And the other point that's important for us to understand is that, generally speaking, everybody married along this time around 40 years of age. Didn't start having kids. They didn't marry. That was true of Jacob. That was true of a number of these. So that seemed to be the average marriage age. So I took that number. And Amram was Kohath's second son, so I gave him a couple of years. Gave him 40 plus 2. Get married at 40, 2 years to have Kohath. And then I started kind of looking at the numbers. And the column on the left is 215 years. The column on the right is 400 years. And if he was 42 when he had Jochebed, that's his sister, had Amram, that would put Jochebed having been birthed to Levi when he was really, really old. That's possible. Abraham had children afterwards, after he was 100 years of age. So the limitation there was more on the women than the men, it would seem. But if indeed that's an accurate translation, Jochebed would have been birthed once he was in the land when he was close to 100 years of age, probably, because he went in around 60 as best I can tell. And Amram, who would have been his grandson, married his sister, which again wasn't totally uncommon. Could have been a half-sister. Abraham married, you remember all of that. There are 2 things that we do know. We do know that that Moses lived for 80 years. So he was born in the land, he left at age 80. So we're just working ourselves back from there. If you got 80 years, Moses born at 53, Jochebed married Amram at 40, and Kohath had her at 42, then that's 215 years. And again, I'm just kind of looking at the numbers there. That makes sense to me. This doesn't. Levi would have had to have been 106 when he had Kohath. I mean, not Kohath, but yeah. I mean, it just starts, there's too much time. It doesn't make sense to me. All right, so again, I threw this in just because I think it's interesting. What I did to get some sense of the age was actually go through and look at the people, first, second, or third son. The earliest that Levi could have been born was 50 years. Jacob went to Padan Aram at 40 years of age. Remember, he worked 7 years before he got Rachel. They didn't have any kids. He gets Leah probably at the same time. But the earliest he could have had Levi, which would have been the third son through Leah, would have been about 50 years of age because he worked to 47 to get the 2 daughters. So Levi being the third son, 50 is as early as he could have done. Chances are, and this works a whole lot better We know he went into the land at 130, that he probably had Levi when he was around 61, and then you kind of see some of the interesting things here. I mean, this is just how it works out. We know this number, and we know basically we've got a pretty good sense of these numbers. So that would have meant that Joseph was sold when he was 17. He's in Potiphar's house 19 years. I mean, the numbers just are pretty well what they are. He could have, you got 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and then I gave him an extra 3 years in order to get to the 130. So Joseph was probably sold when Jacob was around 92. So he's gone a long time. Anyway, I just found that fascinating to kind of run down through that. Yeah, and here's some numbers we do know. We know when the promise was made. God tells us how old he was. He was 75 years of age. The birth of Isaac was 25 years later when he was 100. So the birth of Jacob was at 60, and Isaac, and we know those numbers. When he was 60 years old, so you got the birth of Isaac, 60 years of age, he gives birth to Jacob, and then Jacob enters Egypt at 130. Again, that's 215 years. Is there some guesswork? Yeah, there is. But again, what I was trying to do is what's most plausible. And it's much more plausible to me, in addition to the fact that I think that's what Galatians 3 is saying. All right, here's some of my hand scratching just real quickly. And there are some, if you're a genealogist, you're going to say you've missed a whole lot of things. Or if you're a good mathematician, you may go, you have missed that royally. And very well could be. But what I did was I've got, and one discrepancy right off the bat, I've got Kohath having children 3 years after he gets there. If he was as young as my other chart indicates that he was, there's about a 40-year, there's approximately a 40-year gap there. What I did, and again, I apologize. I apologize up front, okay? But what I did was I figured that a true generation was about 40 years. It took about 40 years for them to get married, get old enough to get married, start having children. So I gave them 40 years per. These are not generations. These are reproductive cycles. Okay, does that make sense? Every 40 years, there are more reproductive cycles than there are generations that we were looking at a moment ago. If you take 40 years, you divide it into 200, you've got 5 cycles, potentially. Have you ever read or seen the little meme or something where they say, would you rather have $1 million or a penny doubled every day for a month? You ever seen that? Which one are you going to take? Before I read it, I would have taken $1 million. You know how much a penny doubled every day is for 30 days? It's over $5 million. It's in 31 days, it's $10 million. That's just doubling. It's called compounding. And that's basically what I did with this was I said, okay, how many sons or how many children did Jacob have, the patriarch who went down into Egypt? He had a dozen plus daughters, right? How many wives did he have? He had 4. So what I did was I figured after scratching that if every male that was born had 6 sons and 6 daughters. And the way to do that is, what I did was I said, all right, each one of them's got 4 wives, and each of the wives has 3 children. That's where I came up with that number. And Jacob did. And I think what's important is in Genesis 46, verse 3, he says, I'm God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for there I will make of thee a great nation. When I'd plug it into AI, it would come up with some crazy number like 700,000. And when I would dispute it, it would say, well, there's mortality rate. There's never been a rate of growth past 2.5. That's the highest ever known, on and on and on. And I'm saying that's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is what's possible. If God wanted them to grow like they grew in 215 years, what's possible? So if every subsequent generation, by the way, there were 58 of them. I didn't take the 12 patriarchs. There were 58 of them left that were children and males. If they each had 4 wives and 3 children apiece, that's 696. You take half of those being female, half male, and you just start going down. After really basically 4 cycles, you're looking at 902, and I've got half male, half female. So already by the end of 4 cycles, year 175, you've got 451,008, plus I just added the ones above that because they still would be fighting age, and you come up with this number right here. So is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. So anyway, how much time that took? Way too much time. I apologize, guys, but I think it's important for us to kind of get a sense of what Paul's saying here and his point. I hope it was worth the few minutes I spent extra here. All right, we're in chapter 3, verse 19. And let me just say at the outset, chapter 3 is the chapter in Galatians that I've dreaded. Not dreaded. It's the most challenging chapter in the book of Galatians to me because there's so much in it. There's so many little arguments. Last week we talked about some of the arguments, some of the bigger arguments about the law and what the law would do and what the law wouldn't do, and he making some arguments down through the early part of chapter 3. Beginning in verse 19 of Galatians chapter 3, we've already talked a lot about what the law wouldn't do. There's no justification by the law. It could not make alive. Righteousness was not possible. It couldn't annul the covenants. The inheritance was not of the law. The promise, we spent a lot of time, and he spent a lot of time talking about what the law wouldn't do. We're going to start a section primarily in verse 22 where he's talking about what the law did do. We've got a couple of more things here, beginning in verse 19. Where he asks or anticipates a question by saying, okay, if the law couldn't do any of these things, what good is it? I think that's his question. What is the law is the question there in verse 19. And he goes on to say, he says, well, the law was added. And I call that a minor premise there. We don't need to lose sight of what he's saying there. What's under discussion? The promise. What was the promise? The promise was salvation by faith to all men. That's the promise. Remember we had a slide. There are 2 possible ways of salvation. Perfect law keeping or salvation by faith. That's what's under discussion here. He's talked about the law and the fact that even a man's covenant couldn't be broken. What about God's covenant? Couldn't be broken. It's over and over. What's under discussion is the promise of God, which is salvation by faith. What he says here is the law was added. Added to what? Literally, the Greek word means to lay alongside. It was added to the promise. Now, what's his argument here? What's more important? The thing that is added to or the thing that is the constant here? Does that make sense? You see the argument that he's making. He's saying the law was added, and we just looked 430 years later. And that's a critical point that he's making. But that's not the primary point I don't think he's making here. He's making the point that it was added because of transgression. I'll be honest with you, this is a passage that's given me difficulty in understanding why, until I began to try to back up and look at what he's saying here and reflect on some of the things that he says in the book of Romans. And I want you to turn with me to Romans chapter 7, because I think it's critical that we understand the point he makes here concerning the law and its purpose here. He goes into a lot more detail here in Romans 7. He says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? I've struggled with that too. What does he mean by that? Is the law sin? He's, again, anticipating an objection. But it seems to me, I was thinking about it, what does sin mean? It means to miss the mark. And he may well be asking the question here, does the law miss the mark? Was it a mistake? That seems to be what's under. That's certainly the gist of what he's saying there, whether that's what that means exactly or not. And he says, God forbid, may it never be. May, genomai, I think is the Greek. May being a negative, no. Genomai means to become or to be. He says it can't happen. It's impossible. Why? God doesn't make a mistake. He says, howbeit, I had not known sin except through the law. This is verse 7. For I had not known coveting except the law said, thou shalt not covet. There are a lot of sins that we could probably figure out, right? Murder is one of those. I think I would have figured out that murder is a bad thing. Maybe not, but I think I would. I think mankind, even bad societies tend to have an understanding that certain things are wrong, right? Murder would be one of those things. But what he says here is coveting I never would have come up with. That wanting something, I'm not taking it. I'm not doing anything, but I want it. He says I never would have come up with that one. And I think that's right. I think there are a lot of things that are restrictive in God's law that are based on the fact that God's holy nature simply doesn't tolerate certain kinds of behavior. So how had mankind been doing up to the law being given? Not real well, had they? A few of them had, but had done okay, but it had gotten so bad that God had already destroyed it once. So I think his point may well be in Galatians chapter 3 that ultimately it was only fair for God, if his nature wouldn't tolerate certain kinds of behavior, that he'd lay a law out. He'd lay it alongside the promise so that man understands and man knows. That seems to me to be the sense of Galatians chapter 3. It was important for us to, and quite honestly only fair, I use that illustration since Beth's not here, I'll use it again. You ever, particularly early on in your marriage, your wife's cool, really cold, and you know something's wrong. And you say, what did I do? And she says, if you don't know, I'm not telling you. I know I've used that illustration before. Well, in all fairness, usually we have a pretty good idea, right? But let's say we didn't. Would that be fair? No. And the same's true with God, that if there are certain things that his nature simply wouldn't tolerate, it's not fair. And I think that's kind of, or at least part of the point that he's making here. In verses 19 through 20 of Galatians, and let me get back over here. He's going to make another argument here. He says, what then is the law? It was added because of transgression till the seed should come, to whom the promise had been made. And it was ordained through angels by the hand of a mediator. So this is the second part of that. And again, this is a section that kind of threw me. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and talking to myself about it, not talking to anybody else about it. I do a lot of talking. When I ride, I'm a genius when I ride my bike. Y'all remember that, don't you? I can remember everything. I can solve any problem. Problem is it's gone when I get off my bike. He talks about, in this verse, let's see, verse 20. The promise had been made, and it was ordained through angels by the hand, talking of the law. The law was added till the seed should come, and it was ordained through the angels by the hand of a mediator. He's contrasting that in verse 20 with the promise. And here's the contrast. The law was ordained by angels through the hand of a mediator. All right? That's what he says here. And he says about the promise of God, there was no mediator, there were no angels, there was just one. What's his point? And again, it's a rather subtle point. I think his point is this. God personally made the promise to Abraham about the promise. As a matter of fact, in Genesis chapter 22, when Abraham has just offered Isaac, and it's one of the more effusive comments by deity that I can think of in the entire Bible. But God says to Abraham, now I know. Now I know. And I swear by myself to make these promises come true. Hebrews 6 alludes to that, where he talks about he swore by himself. And it says in Hebrews 6 that by two immutable or unchangeable things that establishes the truth. What are they? The Word of God. He really doesn't need to swear, does he? But he does on this occasion. He swore. He spoke it, and he can only speak truth, but he swore for man's benefit. He swore by himself. Let me ask you a question. Let's say somebody knocks on your door and they say, hey, I'm Elon Musk's son. I'm going to give you $1 million. My dad's going to give you $1 million. And the next day, contrast that with somebody else that Elon calls or goes to his door and knocks on it and says, I'm fixing to give you $1 million. Which one would carry more weight for you? I think that's his point here. God makes this promise personally, and he swears personally, where the law came by the hand. It was from God, but it came by the hand of angels through a mediator. And I think that's the contrast in this verse. There are some other places where he makes a similar comment or similar point. In verses, 15 and 17, he's talking about a covenant that God made as opposed to man's covenant. He's contrasting the two. But I think that's his point in these verses, that both of these, promise and the law, originate from God, but one of them is far superior because of how it was established. All right, the next question in verse 21 is, he says, is the law then against? Is it against the promise? Well, this is where he uses the expression meginomai again, the one we looked at earlier in Romans chapter 7. And again, may being a negative and genomai meaning to be. It's literally, it can never be. God doesn't make mistakes. And I think that's the sub-premise, and I think it probably is, just based on what he asked. I mean, it's almost it's not blasphemous to ask those questions, but it's, you want to think it's almost right. It's kind of bordering on that. What he's going to say, the implication that he makes in these verses is that these were two different things. Again, we just talked about, he says that the law was laid alongside the promise. The promise pre-existing, and and the law was laid alongside because of transgressions, to identify transgressions, to help man understand. But there are several passages that talk about the fact that the law simply could not, we spent last class period talking about the law could not take away sin. All it could do was condemn, because it was just made up of a system of laws. All you can do with a system of laws is violate one of them. And once you violate one, you're a transgressor. The promise, if you remember, the promise described in these verses is salvation on the basis of faith, or righteousness on the basis of faith, or justification on the basis of faith. And it is described as the gospel in 3:8. It's described as the blessing promise also in chapter 3, verse 8, where he says that God preached the gospel unto Abraham, and he says specifically that the blessings of Abraham, he ties them in with the concept of justification to Gentiles in that passage, on the basis of their faith in Jesus Christ. He describes it as the blessing of Abraham, the promise of the Spirit, the inheritance in chapter 3, verse 18. He describes it as the promises of God, the promise by faith in Jesus Christ in verse 22. What he's describing here is a law that can't take away sin, contrasted with a promise that's its primary focus, is taking away sin, righteousness, justification. I think that's the point that he's making here when he says, it can't be against the promises. God doesn't make a mistake. But you need to understand that one of them couldn't do something that was the very purpose of the other. Does that make sense? I think that's his point in the passage. And now, beginning in verse 22, he starts talking about some of the good things the law does. And you might look at them and go, wait a minute. Those don't seem like such good things. Because the first thing he's going to talk about is the fact that the law shut up all things under sin. Is that a good thing? Well, he says that it is, I think. Why did God shut all... Earlier, he talked about shutting everything up under the law. I'm sorry. No, I'm a little ahead of myself. Yeah, under sin. He shut up all things under sin. Here, in verse 22, he's talking about shutting all things up under the law. The word shut up, or held, however you want, is this word, I can't remember how to pronounce it, but anyway. It is a compound word which means to shut something up together, all right? And it is used in Luke chapter 5, verse 6 when it talks about the fishnet of the disciples closing around. No, I guess it's in a parable, isn't it? Closing around a whole group of fish. They are all caught up together. They're in it together, all together. And why is that a good purpose? Well, he says it was important. It was important that all men, Jew and Gentile, realize the futility. And he's not saying this. This is what I think he's saying, okay? They needed to understand the futility and the direness of their circumstances. There are lots of parables. The one that comes to mind almost immediately, you probably think of 15 others. But the guy that owed his Lord 10,000 talents, what's the point of that? It was something he couldn't pay. The blood of Christ is contrasted with riches, gold and silver. We're not redeemed by those things. We're redeemed by something far more precious. Why did it take that? Because we were in a mess. We didn't know it. In Galatians, or rather in Romans, chapter 1, he spends a great deal of his time there talking about the Gentiles. And the reader, who was a Jew, if he was a Jew, would have been going, right on, brother. Preach it. You're right. These are sorry people. all the way through chapter 1. But in chapter 1, he says, hey, now you, are you without excuse? Were you guilty? And he says, yeah, you were. You had the law. You had a lot of advantages. And yet, you didn't take advantage of them. You're in as bad a shape as they are. I'm reminded of the incident where the Jews brought a lady who had been caught in adultery. Did they set it up? I don't know. Maybe. Was that below them? I don't think so. Maybe they knew somebody with a proclivity. Whatever. They caught her. Didn't bring the man. The immorality among the priesthood was unbelievable by the time Jesus came. They weren't even believers. Certainly not believers in the resurrection, really not believers in God. They believed in nothing but themselves and enriching themselves. The Jews were a mess. And his point here, I think, the point here is that all men, Jew and Gentile, and that's what he says in the book of Romans. In chapter 3, verses 8 or 9 first, and then in verse 23, they're all under sin. You're all under sin. So was that a good thing? I think Paul is saying it was. Because we needed to understand that we couldn't pay the price. Once we transgressed, there was no way out. And that was true whether you're a Gentile or a Jew. Did the Gentiles have a law? Yes, they had a law. Paul in Romans says, where there is no law, there is no sin. And they've just been accusing of sinning. Yeah, there was a law. It wasn't codified. It wasn't written down like the old law was. And it didn't have a great deal of detail. God communicating through the righteous men that were living, the fathers, the righteous fathers certainly. But they had law. And they transgressed law. And he's saying, what this did was make everybody realize the predicament they were in. When they thought about it and realized, all right, Paul makes a point in Romans chapter 7 and verse 13. He says, when did that which is good become death unto me? He's talking about the law there. You know, did that which was, and he said, yeah, it did become, the law is good. It provided a service for us. And he's going to talk about that in the next point as well. But it did not. It did not kill me. My sin killed me. He says, sin that it might be shown to be sin by working death to me through that which is good, that through the commandment sin might become exceeding sinful. By God pronouncing the death sentence on even the smallest of sins, it demonstrated to us how intolerant God was to this kind of behavior, whether it be covetousness or murder. That God was completely against. And it's like, if I transgress a law and I pay a $10 fine, okay, let's say I park somewhere I shouldn't, I pay a $10 fine. What if it was a death penalty for parking there? What would that do for me? It'd say, hey, come on. And that's his point here. Once we understood that there was no way out, there was no possible sense of salvation. Again, as I said there, it's the greatest of contrasts between the old law and the new law. And now he's going to talk, we don't have time to get into this, but the law is a guardian. He uses an illustration here, a steward, a tutor, he's going to say, that we were not only bound under sin, but we're also held under the law. We were shut up, using the same word there, under the law to be tutored by Christ. And we'll pick up there. next time. Thank you. I appreciate y'all letting me go through the mind-numbing numbers at the beginning of this class. I'd spent too much time on them not to at least go over. Thank y'all.